And so the story of seed really started through the recognition a couple of years ago of three problems that we see in our current context. And the first of those problems has to do with conversations that I had been having with people who felt frustrated in their faith. Frustrated that there seemed to be a disconnect between their faith and most of their life. A lack of agency, a sense that following Jesus should make a difference in the world, but a current experience that fell short of that expectation. So that's the first of the issues. The second is one that I've been working on for a lot of years now, and that's the simple reality that the world is not as God intends it to be. When we look around us, we see brokenness, we see injustice, we see oppression. And there's a sense that Christians should be at the forefront of finding solutions to these problems, creative, innovative solutions, and yet many of us lack the capital or the networks or the skills to respond to the issues that we see. So that's the second. And the third is that increasingly we find ourselves as Christians and the church being pushed to the margins of our culture, where we used to enjoy a place of, respect and perhaps even power, where people wanted to hear what we had to say about particular issues. That is not so much the case anymore. And we're struggling, I think, to share good news, what we know is good news, to an audience that's not ready to listen. So a sense that we need to create opportunities to tell this gospel story by demonstrating its world-changing implications in the way we live our lives. And so into that context, the idea of seed was created. And seed, I guess, exists to try and help people discover a God-given purpose and then to live it in the world. That's what drives us, it's what motivates us, it's our passion. I guess you could call it the seed of seed. So the reality is that many followers of Jesus simply do not have a framework that enables them to situate the ordinariness of their everyday lives in the purposes and plans of God, or to situate it in their own sense of purpose and meaning. And so far from being pie in the sky, I think this is desperately needed. Deeply grounded in reality, every action, work, rest, play, flowing out of a sense of God-given purpose and then directed toward the achievement of that same God-given purpose. For us, that begins, I think, with the knowledge of God. It's a revelation from God about who He is. But beyond just understanding God's purposes in the world, it's also about what God says about who we are. Our knowledge of self, but not through some sort of kind of self-introspection, but through a clear understanding of what God's designation over us is, what God says about who we are. A clear understanding of the identity that God has given us. See, Scripture is actually soaked in language of identity. Here's just a couple of passages. 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 17. You are a new creation. If you're in Christ, the old has gone, the new has come. Ephesians chapter 2, verse 19, coming at the end of a beautiful passage in Ephesians chapter 2, talks about being members of God's household, citizens of God's kingdom. This is identity language. So at the core of Seed, I want to say, before we get into anything that we do in society, is the work of formation. We exist to help people find what I like to call their sweet spot. And it's the place where there's alignment between their identity, who God says they are, and their purpose, what they're meant to be doing in the world. So our conception of purpose is that we're called to live into and up to who God has made us to be by His grace in Jesus Christ. God changes us through His grace. As we start to understand that new reality and seek to live congruent with it, live into it, live up to it, then we find this sweet spot, this alignment that I think so many of us are looking for. And with that as our foundation, what do we actually do at Seed? Well, we enable Christians to be catalysts for cultural change. We don't have to solve the world's problems. That's God's responsibility. But we are called to engage, to be salt and light, to demonstrate or to embody a different reality, a reality that's more congruent with God's view of reality. And friends, as we start to live congruent with that new identity, then I think we will, by our very nature, be agents of change in a broken world. We will be people who meet injustice with justice, who meet brokenness with healing, who bring light where there is darkness. Sociologists sometimes talk about culture as being a cage. They talk about being in a cage because there are these implicit and explicit rules in any culture that define the way we behave. Essentially, any space that we live in or inhabit in culture, there are some frameworks and some rules that determine the way we behave. They define the terms of possibility and impossibility. And so we want to think about, how can we change the shape of our cage? What would it look like to challenge these assumptions, these perceptions, these behaviours? And I guess I want to tell you a story about a conversation that I had with my friend Grant, who's standing over there taking some photos for us tonight. He's actually taken the images that have been used in our branding. Now, last year, myself and Grant sat down and we had a conversation over breakfast one day. Grant is one of the leading graphic designers in the country. For the last decade or so, he's been the lead designer at the Sydney Theatre Company. But what Grant has always wanted to do, his passion, is to be a fashion photographer. Now, as a person with a deep faith, it seems like there's a lack of alignment, doesn't it, between someone who has a deep faith and someone who wants to work in the fashion industry as a fashion photographer. And I guess Grant, I hope you don't mind me telling this story, mate, but in the context of our conversation, he doesn't want to end up going into the fashion industry and having to compromise his faith because the parameters of the cultural cage that are the fashion industry would force him to compromise the values that he has and holds dear because of his faith. So as we talked, it became clear that really Grant at the time saw that there are two options. Either you step into the fashion industry and you're forced to do things that compromise your faith, or you stay out and you don't pursue what you feel is a God-given passion, a God-given calling. But I guess what we want to ask at Seed, and what me and Grant talked about that morning as we had breakfast, was what if we could change the shape of the cage? What if through Grant and his story and his passion, and maybe gathering some people around Grant, we could actually challenge the way the fashion industry operates, so that not only could Grant end up fitting in the industry, but perhaps could even lead the industry in some way to embody more of God's intention for creation. And our core question, our driving question is, how do we show people what a world aligned with the King and his kingdom looks like? That's our driving question. And I guess in summary, in response to that, what we're trying to do is two things. We want to take people through a process of identifying what the change we seek is, a change that is congruent with God's intention for his creation. Then we want to take them through a process of trying to identify something that can act as a catalyst for that change and help them to create that thing. And then we want to design a strategy around that thing that amplifies the change that we seek. So our framework, this is developing and we're continuing to work on it. But essentially we see that any effective change that is aligned with God's intention for creation would have 5 steps to it. The first I've talked about a bit has to do with purpose. What's God's purpose? What's our purpose? How do we align the two? The second has to do with a process of imagination. It's questions around how do we actually imagine a different reality that may be more congruent with God's intention for his creation. The third step has to do with designing, so finding that thing that has the capacity to create the change that we seek, and then building a strategy around that thing. And I think we have some particular skills to bring to bear on that. at Seed. It's things like building movements, creating networks, creating coalitions, multi-stakeholder coalitions to form around a particular issue or a particular project for change. It's things about identifying and engaging with levers of power who have the capacity to create that change. And it's skills of communication to tell those stories in a way that they actually amplify that change. So that's the design step. The create step is about actually creating those things and those strategies. And then the communication step I've already mentioned is about telling that story in a way that bears witness to Jesus and results in the glory of God. But that all sits for us in a developing structure. And there are 3 parts to Seed and what Seed is going to look like. Seed ideas, Seed community, and Seed initiatives. Seed ideas is basically the work that we want to do with the whole of the Christian community in the country. It's focused on the first of the 2 steps in that framework, helping them to understand God's purpose and their own purpose, and then helping to imagine how they can live a life that is more aligned with that purpose. It's about thought leadership, it's about research, it's about trying to understand how we can better engage and bring faith to life. The second is Seed community. And this is about inviting people to engage with Seed in a more significant way. We're looking, I guess, for digital and physical expressions of community where people who will gather around either a particular social issue or gather around a particular industry sector where they have a common purpose and try and take them through the process of understanding purpose, imagining a different reality, and then actually designing something that could create some change that is more congruent with God's intention. And I guess out of these community spaces, we believe, and I know this is going to be the case, that some ideas will emerge that actually have real potential for change. And so this is where Seed Initiatives is putting the meat on the bones. I think there's a real problem in the church at the moment with disembodiment. If even a small proportion of God's people, of people who say they follow Jesus, lived the way that Jesus lived, then the world would be a very different place. But when you look at the evidence of what we think the response to disembodiment is, you would say that we think the response is more analysis. We just kind of think our way into a different world. And somehow the magic happens. We help people understand a different worldview and then somehow they just go and do it themselves. But I guess we want to create a space where we can actually create some things, because ideas don't actually change the world. Ideas that turn into something change the world. And so Seed Initiatives is about the application of our whole model, taking a group or a person through this whole process to the point of creation. And in this space, to give it a bit more clarity again, basically we see that we offer 3 things. We consult to faith-based organisations. So a great example of this is Ken is here from the Baptist Association, the Director of Ministries with the Baptist Association, and already they've engaged us as Seed on a year-long contract to help them design and then implement their whole public engagement strategy for the Baptist Union in the state. It's an exciting piece of work. It's exactly the kind of work that we want to be doing. So if organisations think that we can help them create change that they seek, then we really want to work with them. Collaboration is very similar. But the reality is that some of these movements for change actually require multiple stakeholders to come together from different sectors to create the change that we seek. And so we want to act as a facilitator or a broker for those different sectoral groups to come together around a particular change project. And then the third one, perhaps the hardest to understand, is the idea of incubation. And this is where we essentially want to go out and we want to turn our eyes out to the Christian community in Australia and say, what are your ideas? What are your ideas that are aligned with God's intention for creation that you think can actually make a difference in the world? And we want to invest in those ideas. If we can effectively take people through this process, give them access to an investor community that we're looking to develop, as well as a business support community where they come into seed and they get access to the expertise that they need to take their ideas to scale and to make them sustainable. If we can do that, then we should see, and this is our dream, these 3 outcomes. And these 3 outcomes are deeply connected with the 3 problems that I shared at the beginning. If we can do change effectively, it's not just the change that we create beyond ourselves, but if we can do change effectively, we should see flourishing individuals who find alignment with a God-given purpose and start to, move away from some of the tensions that they feel and the frustrations that they feel in their lives from day to day. We should see society flourishing as Christians come to the forefront of finding solutions to social problems. And then we should see God glorified as we kind of rub up against the world with a different way of expressing reality and have an opportunity to tell people why we live differently and bear witness to Jesus and the difference that he makes. In summary, friends, we believe that the best way to influence culture is to create culture. It's not to condemn culture, to critique culture, or even try and transform culture. The best way to change culture is to create a different possibility, to move it into the neighbourhood, to show people what something different can look like, and then to tell the story of why it looks different. One more example, which I think is a beautiful example of this, the best that I've seen in the country to date, is the guys at Red Frogs. Some of you might know of Red Frogs. It's a group of guys up in Queensland who looked at youth culture as it was expressed in Surfers Paradise at Schoolies Week. And they said, this is clearly not how God intended it to be and not how God intended our young people to live. So what can we do about it? Well, they could have gone and tried to get policies changed around youth alcoholism, or get more police on the streets, or got into the papers and started condemning young people for binge drinking. But no, they decided that they had already a tribe of young people. And they thought, well, let's get our young people and let's get them to embody what it would look like for us to live in line with God's purposes for us. And let's move it in to the Gold Coast alongside this youth culture that has developed. And so they started doing things like cooking pancakes for young people at night after they get home drunk to soak up the alcohol. They started putting teams on the streets to walk home with people and make sure they got home safely. They set up a lifeline where people could call in when they were having suicidal tendencies. They embodied a different reality, and that has given them an opportunity to tell a different story, and it's creating real change around youth culture in Queensland, and now not only around different parts of the country, but also around different parts of the world as well. I think it's a beautiful, beautiful example. Yeah, I guess I just want to reiterate that this is a dream that I've had. It's exciting that some people have already decided to join me in that dream. Most of you know me. I don't have any interest in this being all about me. I really am desiring to create a space. I see that there is no space for this at the moment. There are some people who are doing great work in the public space, who are leaders in going out there and sharing what the Christian worldview is all about. What I don't think we have is something that turns it round the other way and says, okay, what's your idea? What's your God-given purpose? What's the passion in you that God wants to bring to life? And we want to invest in that. We want to form that. And so I want to create a community that helps people do that. A community, as I've said, where people can wrestle together, seek answers together, and seek to be faithful to our God together. And if we can do that, then maybe, just maybe, we can see people flourishing, coming alive in their faith. We can see society flourishing as we solve some of the big problems of our time. And we can see God glorified as we live into and up to what God has already made us to be. So I invite you to be a part of that and would love you to join us on the journey.